This week on Q&A, historian and author Edmund Morris discusses his newly released book, the last in a trilogy about Teddy Roosevelt. It's called Colonel Roosevelt.
Edmund Morris, I want to go back to the first words you wrote about Theodore Roosevelt in 1979 in your first of 3 books. And you started it off in a prologue, New Year's Day, 1907. At 11 o'clock precisely, the sound of trumpets echoes within the White House and floats through open windows out into the sunny morning. Do you remember what mood you were in when you had to write those first words?
Yes, it was a mood of complete despair. I'd been trying for months to get the book started. I knew in my head that I was going to start with New Year's Day of 1907 because I'd found out quite by accident, browsing the Guinness Book of World Records, that on January the 1st, 1907, President Theodore Roosevelt shook more hands than any other person in history. And I thought I could see the book growing out of that reception when he received the American people on that day. And for months I researched the day, discovering to my amazement how dense and detailed newspaper records were in those days. People didn't have television, so they needed details, visual details, and olfactory details, all sorts of atmospheric stuff. So I absorbed all this massive material, and then I had to sit down and write a prologue in which the reader, as it were, meets the president, as though the reader is in that line. But I never wanted to take the stylistic liberty of saying, you are there. I wanted it to be straight historical biography. So developing the technique of writing a prologue in the third person, which gives the impression that it's written in the first person, was so difficult that when I wrote that first line, I didn't think I'd ever be able to finish. It took me about a year to write that prologue.
That was in 1979.
Mm-hmm.
This is 2010.
Mm-hmm.
Here are the last words you wrote in your final book, one of 3, 1 million words, 2,500 pages later. As part of a class exercise paying tribute to the late Colonel, Thomas Maher, or Mayer, M-A-H-E-R, wrote, quote, he was a fulfiller of good intentions, unquote.
Thanks, Brian. You just gave away my last line.
But you told me years ago that you had already written that last line.
Yes, it was written in my head. In fact, more or less when I wrote the first line of the book, of the first book, because I was doing research in Theodore Roosevelt's birthplace in New York, which in those days was a disused library full of dusty piles of old papers and records. And I came across this yellow manila envelope of schoolboy essays written shortly after his death. Some class exercise. The children were asked to write appreciations of the dead man. And I came across this one essay with this one sentence. He was the fulfiller of good intentions. And I knew then, in 1979, that no matter how long it took to write the 3 volumes, that was going to be the last line of the last book.
When did you actually physically write that last line? What time in the last several months?
I wrote it in January of this year, 2010. I called my wife up from downstairs. I said, darling, come and look at this. And as I wrote it, she stood over me and I tapped it out. And that was the end of 30 years of work.
This is a very broad question, but what's this experience been like?
It's been enriching, life-enhancing, educational, because I'm not American-born, as you can tell from my accent, but I am an American citizen who came here in 1968 wanting to learn about my country of adoption, and I couldn't think of a better way to learn all about America, its character and its history, and its essential principles than by studying the life of Theodore Roosevelt.
back in 1999, I think maybe the last time we talked, I'm not sure, it was for your Reagan book, Dutch. I asked you, we got some video of that moment, I asked you about the early introduction to Theodore Roosevelt. Let's watch.
There was a preliminary apprehension of him when I was a small boy in Kenya. At the age of 10, I looked in a civic history of Nairobi that was published to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the city. And it had this historic photograph of President Theodore Roosevelt coming to Nairobi, Kenya in 1909 on his great safari for the Smithsonian. I remember identifying as a small boy with that picture. The smile, the snarl, the spectacles. There was something about him that attracted me. And a quarter of a century later, I ended up writing his biography.
When is your second edition of the three-parter on Theodore Roosevelt coming out?
It's going to have to come out on September the 14th, 2001, because that will be the centenary of his emergency inauguration as McKinley's successor.
Are you on time this time also with the third book?
I was just thinking, thank God it did not come out on September 14th, 2001, because that would have been 3 days after 9/11. And I don't think anybody in the country read a book for the next 2 months. As it happened, it was slightly delayed, and it came out after Thanksgiving, just when people were in the need for reading something about a really positive presidential force. So the book did very well. But it would have been a disaster if it had come out when it was planned to come out.
Is this one on schedule then, the new one?
Yeah.
The third one?
Yeah.
How have you changed your mind about Theodore Roosevelt in the last 30 plus years?
I've been increasingly impressed by the quality of his intellect. It was always obvious to me right from the start he was a superbly bright man, but I thought his smarts were primarily political. And indeed they were through most of his middle years. But after he left the White House in March of 1909 and began a life of journalism and book writing, the quality of his mind deepened and broadened to an astonishing degree. Some of the essays that he wrote about the conflict between science and religion and imagery in medieval literature and subjects like that. And in the year 1911, when he was completely out of political power, these essays are truly impressive. They reflect reading in 3 languages, English, German, and French, some Italian too, enormous Catholic intelligence and erudition. And to think that this man was also a superbly successful president of the United States is to realize that he was, as somebody once said, a polygon, a man of many, many dimensions.
In the middle of all this, your book, Dutch, came out. And the question I want to ask you is what's the difference about writing about a man who's been dead for years versus a man who was alive? What are the two experiences like?
A journalist once asked me that question after I made the contract to do the Reagan biography. He said to me, Edmund, is it easier to write about a live person or a dead person? And I hadn't thought of it, and I was struggling to think what to say when my wife, who was in the next room, shouted out, "Dead is easier." And of course this journalist used that line to begin his article in the New York Times the following day. And she got a T-shirt a couple of days later, which has "Dead is easier" all over the front, and which she wears when she gives lectures. However, I think that they both have difficulties. To write about a dead person is to be a prisoner of the existing material. If there is not any material on something important, if the material happens to have evaporated or was never set down, then one cannot chronicle that event. But if you're writing about a live person, you have to deal with the live sensibilities, not only of that person, but of his family, his contemporaries, his friends. In Reagan's case, I was writing about a living president of the United States. So I had to deal not too much with his sensibilities, because Reagan was so sure of himself he didn't care what people wrote or thought about him, but with his wife, his children, his friends, and the American people. So that posed problems too.
Who did you get the closest to in the Theodore Roosevelt family? And how many of his family were you able to talk to?
Oh, I interviewed his youngest son, his second youngest son, Archie, just shortly before he died, and also Alice Roosevelt Longworth, when she was pretty ancient, and descendants, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, who have to a certain extent been helpful. I guess the most useful was Archibald Roosevelt Jr., who was quite a fixture here in Washington in the 1980s and 90s. Because of all the Roosevelt descendants, he was the one with the best mind. He spoke 16 or 17 languages, and his intellect was enormous, very much like his grandfather's. And when I published my first book about TR, Archie called me up and he said, "I've read your book, Edmund, and I'm staggered by the number of mannerisms that you described that I thought were my own mannerisms, turn out to have been my grandfather's."
Back when we talked in '99, we talked about, you mentioned the people who are alive and their family and friends, but we talked about Nancy Reagan, and this is cut 7 on our list here. I want to run that and get your reaction to what you said back then.
She has always been, throughout her life, very insecure, very suspicious, and totally besotted with her husband. And if she had any inkling, or any suspicion, should I say, that I was going to write a book that was going to make him seem less than great and less than perfect, then it would have caused obvious problems of access. So I preserved a friendship with her, which was quite genuine on the superficial level. I enjoyed being with her. We used to lunch regularly whenever I went to LA, and she gives good lunch. Nancy is fun to be with, providing you keep the conversation on the level that suits her best.
Looking back at the 11 years since this book came out, any thoughts about anything that book brought up, the relationships you had? You talked to Nancy Reagan since then?
No, I knew I would not. I sent her the first copy the day before it was published, with a letter saying, "I know that this is not going to be what you were hoping for, Nancy, but I hope as the years go by you'll realize, if not from reading it yourself, from what other people are saying, that this book shows that your husband was a genuinely great president, whatever his private failings. And I just hope that that gives you some consolation for the fact that I have written very honestly about him." And looking back at Dutch, more than 10 years ago now, it's 11 years I suppose, I look back on it as the happiest period of my life. I had an enormous sense of accomplishment with that book. I know in many quarters of Washington it's perceived as a failure. I heard you last week saying that during your interview with couple of historians. I know it was widely criticized at the time, but it also got, at the same time, the kind of reviews that many authors would die for. It sold over 300,000 copies. It's still selling. I wouldn't change a word of it now. I regard it as my best book. And I'm enormously happy I had that privilege, that unique privilege of being able to see a sitting president in power and write up what I saw and experienced.
Why did you consider that the happiest time in your life?
Because I'd done something original, which is what all writers want. I think I pioneered a new form of biography. And over the years since, other books have come out that use similar techniques, so I think I was onto something new. The Poet Laureate of Great Britain, for example, wrote a biography a couple of years after Dutch of a romantic poet. I've forgotten his name for the moment, but it used the same device of an imaginary narrator and questionings back and forth between the narrator and other points of view. And these techniques are being more and more part of the new non-fiction, which I have been watching with great interest ever since Dutch came out.
A couple of years ago, the other book you've written was about Beethoven.
Mm-hmm.
Why?
Well, I've always loved music, and what I like is literary challenges. To write about Ronald Reagan was a literary challenge because he was a very difficult man to penetrate. TR is a literary challenge because he's so enormous and so multifaceted. Just to portray the whole of him as a superhuman challenge. To write about a composer is to write about music, which is a language almost beyond the power of ordinary language to describe. As Mendelssohn once remarked, music is a superior language to ordinary speech. So the challenge in that case was to write a short book about Beethoven which used language to communicate the essence of music. And I found that a delightful challenge.
Why Beethoven among all the composers?
He's probably the most complex character of the great composers. Bach, for example, is a composer of equal stature, but his character is amorphous and difficult to get at. But Beethoven was so human, so worldly, and so complex that it was a delight to write about him.
Came to the United States in '68.
Mm-hmm.
Lived in London sometime before that. Born in Kenya.
Yeah.
When we last talked, you had an apartment or a house over here on Capitol Hill and a place to live up in New York. What's happened since?
Well, I left Washington shortly after the publication of Theodore Rex in 2001 and moved to Kent, Connecticut. I have an apartment in New York City, which has always been there. So I divide my time between Kent, Connecticut and New York.
3 books. The first one, The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt, was about what era?
That was his pre-presidential life. It ends with a cliffhanger the moment that he hears on the summit of Mount Marcy in New York that President McKinley has been assassinated and that he, as vice president, is now president of the United States.
Where did you write that?
Where did I write that? In my apartment in New York.
In New York. Second book came out in 2001, as we're talking here. Rex. What's that era?
Rex describes his presidential years, 1901 to 1909.
The third one, which is out right now, called Colonel Roosevelt, is for what period?
That's the final 10 years of TR's life, 1909 to 1919.
Given what's going on in the country right now in the United States, what can we learn from this final book about what happens in a country where people are unhappy, or in his case, he was a third-party candidate? What can we learn about third parties, and when did he run as a third-party candidate, and why?
He ran as a third-party candidate in 1912, but exactly a century ago in 1910, shortly after he'd come back to the country, after having been a year away, TR became the spokesman, the oracle of this new force arising in America called progressivism. It was a largely middle-class movement whose common denominator, apart from passion, was a mounting dissatisfaction with government, with federal government, a feeling of exclusion from the tight relationship between Congress and corporations and capitalistic privilege. So this white middle class, passionate movement developed in the later years of TR's presidency, largely inspired by his own gradual swing to the left. And it more or less asked him, drafted him back into politics as its spokesman in the summer of 1910. So the midterm elections that subsequently took place exactly 100 years ago marked the emergence of this new progressive party. It wasn't quite a party yet, it didn't have a capital P, but it was a formidable movement which in 2 short years after that election mutated into a real party, the third party, the Progressive Bull Moose Party of 1912, and fought the most successful third-party candidacy in our history.
Why did he not run in 1908?
Well, he was at the end of his very successful presidency. He was full of smarts and young. He was not yet 50. But he sort of knew in his heart of hearts that if he had another term, which he could have had on a silver platter, if he served another 4 years, he would begin to be corrupt, begin to be too self-righteous, too domineering. There's never a question of financial or political corruption with TR, but he sensed he'd had too much power too long. And he deeply believed that an American president should serve only a finite time and follow the example of George Washington and retire after 2 terms.
Briefly go through how he became president from the vice president. Who picked him to be vice president and why?
He was picked as vice president by William McKinley in 1900, largely to keep him out of the way because he was already, by pretty universal consent, destined to be president in his own right. So McKinley took him as his vice president, and that second term of McKinley lasted only a few days because he was shot in the fall of 1901, precipitating young 42-year-old Theodore Roosevelt into the presidency, the youngest president we've ever had.
So he served out almost the 4 years of that McKinley term and then another 4 years. How big was he re-elected by?
It was not really a re-election. He was elected in his own right in 1904 by a huge margin. I think it was the biggest presidential victory up to that time. And he would have had a similar majority if he'd run again in 1908, which constitutionally he could have. He could have run as many times as he liked.
So when did it start after he left in 08 and he's getting ready for 1912? When did he actually start thinking about doing it again?
He went to Africa on a gigantic safari which lasted almost a year. And in odd dribs and drabs, mail which would reach him by the odd naked runner, letters from friends in America, he began to realize that President Taft was turning out to be a pretty ineffective successor, and that this desire for TR to come back and articulate the hopes and aspirations of progressives was beginning to get stronger and stronger. But it wasn't until he actually returned in the spring of 1910 and discovered how he'd been missed during his year abroad and how urgent the political priorities were that he reluctantly allowed himself to be coaxed back into politics.
Who was pushing it?
At first, it was Governor Hughes of New York, who was a progressive governor who needed political help there. I won't go into the details, but TR reluctantly agreed to do him a favor and help him campaign for primary reform. And by making that fatal decision to help out a struggling governor, he found himself sucked back into party politics. And by the fall of that year, was articulating all the new principles of progressivism.
When did he signal that he was ready to go?
To run for the presidency?
Yeah.
He signaled that in January of 1912. By then, the pressure for him to run was so enormous that he really couldn't resist it. And to be honest, he had in his heart ambition, which began to dominate him. Like all men of great gifts, when they give up power, even though they may give it up for principled reasons, they begin to hanker for it the moment they give it up. And he hankered for the presidency during his 4 years out of power, to such an extent that he agreed to run again in 1912.
You know, when you said that he was, not yet 50 when he left the White House, and we know he, as you tell us, he died when he was 60, so he only really had 10 years. And you talk about this, how sick was he all through his life?
His health seemed to be excellent. He was a strong, florid, enormously energetic man, but privately he did have medical problems. I think he always had a fluttery heart. And his health problems began to be manifest around about 1911, 1912. He began to put on weight seriously. He began to have rheumatic problems and arteriosclerosis. And he had a chronic malaria in his system from his years from his service in Cuba in 1898 in the Spanish-American War. And gradually, as those last 10 years of his life progressed, he began to be more and more subject to illness. Particularly, he went to the Amazon in 1914 and explored the River of Doubt, and very nearly died of tropical fever.
When you set out to get to know him, what year was it originally?
When I set out to get to
know him, in other words, your first book was in '79, but when did you start the process?
It was, oddly enough, it was after Richard Nixon resigned the White House. Nixon, as you may recall, in his farewell speech to the White House staff, suddenly started to quote Theodore Roosevelt.
Last night from TR.
He quoted this little passage. She was beautiful in face and form, there had never come to her any great sorrow. As a fair young flower she lived, and as a fair flower she died. I think Nixon was talking about his mother, but I got curious as to what circumstances had prompted Theodore Roosevelt to write these words. So I did a little research and found out it was the death of his beautiful young wife at the beginning of his political career, and I began to get interested in this real-life drama and began to write a screenplay about it in 1975, I think it was, which I hoped I could sell to television. And as I wrote the screenplay, I got more and more interested in him as a character, and a book grew out of the screenplay, and book grew out of book, and here I am, 3 volumes later.
As you look back on your process of getting to know Theodore Roosevelt, how did you do it? Where did you go? Where did you start to see what he was all about? Places that you rummaged through?
I began to get a physical feel for him, which is important for a biographer. One must have the ability to imagine this person in the room or within visible distance. One must have a palpable feeling of a subject, or it's impossible to write about them. I began to get that feeling after about 2 years of research, after I'd been out to the Badlands of Dakota, where he was a young ranchman in the 1880s, after I'd been out to Sagamore Hill, and I'd held in my hand this gold lock of hair from the head of his dead young wife, Alice Lee, after I'd read his diaries, written at Harvard, and had turned over the pages that his hand had turned over. I remember coming across one page describing his honeymoon night with this beautiful Alice Lee, and I was naturally interested to see what he wrote about that night. And in his handwriting he said, "Our sacred happiness cannot be written about." And I had the distinct feeling that I, posterity, future biographer, was being addressed by him. This is private, stay out of my life. So that's when the consciousness of him began.
How long was he married to Alice?
4 years.
What did she die of?
She died of Bright's disease, the same disease that took off Woodrow Wilson's wife shortly after Wilson became president.
And what is Bright's disease?
It's acute glomerulonephritis.
Kidney disease. They had one child, Alice Roosevelt Longworth.
That's right.
What happened? I mean, she was around in my lifetime. I remember seeing her in this town. What was she like? And she was married to a former Speaker of the House who was from Ohio. We
That's
now
right.
are headed to a Speaker from Ohio. So is there any connection there?
Well, at first he traded her away to his sister to look after. The little girl, he just gave her away like a sack of salt, and went west to recover from the death of Alice Lee. But when he came back to marry his second wife, who happened to be his childhood sweetheart, Edith Kermit Roosevelt, she insisted on taking this child back as the first child in their own family. So Alice, little Alice Lee Roosevelt, became the first of 6 children, and grew up to be a complex and extremely interesting woman whose portrait I've painted in quite a lot of detail in Colonel Roosevelt. I've made a point in this book of describing all of his children, making them real characters in his story, because by the time he came back from Africa, they were all on the edge of adulthood and becoming more and more interesting in their own right.
What can you tell us about the other 5 kids? When did he marry his second wife, Edith?
He married his second wife, Edith, in 1886, which was only 2 years after the death of Alice Lee. And it was an extremely happy marriage, an extremely successful one. And she lasted as long as the administration of Harry Truman. And the children they produced, Theodore Roosevelt Jr. was the first, then there was Kermit, then there was another girl, Ethel, and then there was Quentin. Oh, and I've forgotten Archie too. So they had 4 sons and 2 daughters.
How did each of those die?
I tell their stories in the epilogue to Colonel Roosevelt. Alice, the first to be born, was the last to die in 1980. Ted turned out to be a magnificent soldier in World War I, came back in World War II to be a general who went ashore on D-Day with the Third Army and died of a heart attack just a few days after winning the Medal of Honor in the D-Day invasion. He was one of the most highly decorated soldiers of both World Wars. Archie was very similar, a much decorated soldier who died of old age in the late 1970s. Ethel died. Ethel was just a housewife through most of her life, but she dedicated most of her life to preserving the memory of her father and preserving Sagamore Hill, his home on Long Island. Alice became Alice, the famous Princess Alice. And Quentin, the youngest and the brightest and most promising of all his children, was very tragically killed as a fighter pilot in World War I. And I make a great deal of that tragedy at the end of my book on TR's last years, because I think that single tragedy destroyed Theodore Roosevelt himself and was the cause of his death just a few months later at the age of 60.
The movie, The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt, when's it coming out?
It's been under option to various producers for 30 years, but now, very encouragingly, it's been taken over by a producer who has interested Taylor Hackford, who's a very eminent Hollywood director, in doing it. And I believe they're talking to HBO. That's the latest.
And how about the other 2 books? Any interest in doing movies about them?
No.
And what about the books? I have a hardback copy of your first book, reissued. What's the status? Are they reissuing all your books this year?
Yes. The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt is coming out in a new hardback edition, which I'm happy to see you've got there. Exactly uniform with the other 2 books. So the 3 of them, the complete trilogy, is going to be available this season as an irresistible gift.
I want to go to an episode I find so many people don't know about, although we've talked about it on this network, but you have as much detail as I've seen on it, and that is the assassination attempt of Theodore Roosevelt in October of 1912 in Milwaukee. Right. And you say at the end of your book that may have been part of what killed him in the end, that was still left in his system and all that. Would you go back to the beginning and talk about how the assassination came about? Attempt, that is, when he wasn't assassinated.
In Theodore Rex, on the day that TR became president, I have a little section describing how an unemployed tavern keeper in New York called John Schrank reacted to the death of McKinley and the accession of Theodore Roosevelt by having a vision in which the dead President McKinley, emerged from his coffin and pointed at a monk who was manifestly Theodore Roosevelt, dressed as a monk, and said, "Avenge my death, kill this man." So I just dropped that into Theodore X as something which did occur in September of 1901. That same little man, John Schrank, makes his appearance in Colonel Roosevelt in September of 1912, tracking TR around the country as he's campaigning for the Progressive Party, hoping to shoot him at some point or other. Misses several opportunities to assassinate him, but finally caught up with him in Milwaukee in October of 1912. And in circumstances uncannily similar to those which happened when Reagan was nearly killed in 1981, he shot TR in the chest as he was coming out of a hotel en route to a speech. And TR collapsed into his limo, not realizing at first how seriously he'd been shot. John Schrank was taken off by cops and security guards, and TR, instead of allowing his escorts to take him to hospital, insisted on going through with his scheduled speech, marched on stage in the Milwaukee auditorium, threw open his jacket, exposed this great spreading mass of blood, and said, "It takes more than that to kill a bull moose," and spoke for almost 2 hours, at times tottering and nearly falling off the stage. The audience was mesmerized, as you can imagine. But somehow he got through the speech and then allowed them to take him to hospital. And survived, of course, but as I know from watching Reagan recover from his wound, to be hit in the chest with a bullet that stops within an inch or two of your heart clarifies the mind wonderfully and affects one's physical condition ever afterwards.
And they didn't remove the bullet ever?
No. It was impacted on a rib in such a way that it would have been dangerous to remove it, so they left it there. So for the rest of his life, he walked around with a slug in his chest.
I remember seeing down at the American History Museum here the glass case, and you've got a picture in here, and also this 51-page speech, or at least part of it, I think. And then I remember seeing a shirt out in Medora, North Dakota, out near his ranch, that had a white shirt that had a hole in it.
That's right, and the blood stain.
Where are they keeping all that now? I haven't seen them. I think that shirt belongs out there in Medora, but have you seen where the...
No, I don't know. I think the shirt and the speech, the perforated speech with the bullet holes going through it, that I illustrate, I think they both belong to the Theodore Roosevelt birthplace in New York. At least that's where I last saw them. And it's pretty creepy to go there and look at them.
Whatever happened to John Schrank?
He was found mentally incompetent, a paranoid schizophrenic, and he spent the rest of his life in jail, dying, I think, in the 1940s.
You also talk about how Roosevelt went over to him and grabbed him with his hands. What was that all about?
Yes, the security men around TR were wrestling this little guy to the ground in a frenzy, just as they wrestled John Hinckley back in 1981. And the one security guy was really trying to break his neck. So TR called out, "Don't kill him, bring him here." And they brought this little man to TR, and TR, in this oddly gentle gesture, reached and held his face, looked at him, and said, "Why did you do it?" And looking into this guy's face, which you can see very clearly in photographs taken at the time, I think I have a portrait of him, you could just see straight away that dull, expressionless look, which symptomizes insanity. So TR said, "Oh, what's the use? Take him away." And he was taken away to be interrogated and went to jail.
What happened from that moment forward till the end of the campaign with the other candidates, and who were they, and how long was he in the hospital?
He was in hospital for, I think, 10 or 12 days, but it took several weeks before he began to recover, by which time the campaign was practically over. He made one final speech in Madison Square Garden a couple of nights before the election of November 1912. The other two candidates were President Taft, running for re-election, and Governor Woodrow Wilson of New Jersey. And both these men, being gentlemen, said that they would stop campaigning for as long as the colonel was incapacitated.
How'd the election come out?
The election came out as TR knew it would come out, with Woodrow Wilson winning because the third-party candidacy of TR and his progressives split the Republican Party and elected Woodrow Wilson.
I wrote down somewhere the actual totals on the vote, but he got. My memory is he got 27% of the vote, and as you said in the beginning, got the most vote of any third-party candidate. What did you learn in writing about this third-party candidacy that would be of value in 2012 if there's a third-party candidate?
Well, the candidacy, the party's candidacy did produce a progressive minority in the Senate, which was had a good deal of power as a swing unit. But what I think is of more relevance to today's political situation is that when a large minority of the country believes itself to be disenfranchised, excluded from power, excluded by a combination of shared privilege between lawmakers and corporate executives and professional politicians. When this large constituency begins to feel that they are excluded, they become extremely angry, very passionate, and very unified. And the Tea Party movement, which in no way matches the sophistication of the progressive movement, nevertheless has got that unifying feeling. These people feel excluded from power and they want to show that they can get power back. So the fact that the Progressive Party eventually dissolved away is perhaps of some encouragement to the leaders of the two main parties right now. But at the moment, the third party threat, I think, is quite real for the presidential election of 2012.
What did they do wrong then in the 1912 that prevented him from getting elected?
If TR had been nominated by the Republican Party in the spring of 1912, he would have brought all these progressives with him. They were most of them Republicans. And he would have then had that huge vote, and he would without question have been elected president in 1912.
I found a lot of interesting stuff in your notes back in the back. One of the things you do in this third edition, I don't know, I haven't got Theodore Rex with me, but the first book you didn't do it the same way, is you have these biographical notes, the historical notes, and the chronological notes in the back, and full of a lot of interesting stuff, as I said. Where did you get that idea? I have not seen that before.
Well, I wrote it for footnote fetishists like you, Brian.
What was the point? Why were you doing that in the back?
Well, often when one is doing deep research into a character, one comes up with really interesting stuff which doesn't easily fit into the narrative. For example, I have a very long biographical footnote there about his memory, which goes on in great detail. It gives all sorts of examples of this phenomenal memory. If I'd done that in the course of the book, it would have held the story up. So I felt the footnotes was the most appropriate place for that kind of information.
When did you write all these footnotes?
As I was doing the book.
As you went along, stop, write them, put them aside, then put them all together at the end?
That's the joy of the computer. When I wrote my first book on enormous sheets of manuscript paper, 11 by 22, I would have to do all the footnotes in microscopically small handwriting at the bottom of each page. And then if a paragraph was moved to another chapter, I'd have to cut out the footnotes and attach them to the later stages. But now, working on a computer, one can attach the footnotes directly to the text, and they just follow, find their place like tadpoles, wherever you move your text later on.
What was your first book that you wrote on a computer?
I began to write on the computer halfway through Dutch.
And when you were writing Dutch, had you already done a significant amount of your second Roosevelt book?
I'd done about 7 chapters, which I completely rewrote 15 years later when I went back, because I'd changed as a writer by then. And so Theodore Rex, which followed Dutch, was more or less a new book.
How had you changed as a writer?
Well, I think I was just that much older and wiser. When I started Theodore Rex, I was not very hip as a student of presidential politics. Therefore, I found it very difficult to write a book about his presidency when I really didn't understand the White House. But having spent all those years in Reagan's White House and seen the presidency in operation, I could go back to Theodore Rex and rewrite it from the point of view of somebody who'd seen how power works and gotten to understand the nature of the presidency.
We talked a lot about your being around Ronald Reagan. Did you ever total up the number of days that you were in the White House during that last term of his?
No, I didn't, but I came and went quite freely, so it was through most of 1985 through 1989, plus all the time I spent with him after he left the White House.
When we visited with you in your home over here on Capitol Hill a lot of years ago, you showed us your card system on how you were writing Dutch. Did you do the same thing with Theodore Roosevelt?
Yep. I've got yards and yards of cards.
What do you do with all those old cards?
It's a question. I suppose one day I'll archive them in some fashion, but at the moment I have them all stashed in steel cabinets in my house in Kent.
Here's a chronological note in the back of the book. An important chapter in TR's life came to an end on 14 November 1915 when Booker T. Washington died. TR spoke at the memorial service in Tuskegee, Alabama. Why was that an important moment in his life?
Well, he'd always had a special relationship with Booker T. Washington, who was the most eminent black man in America in those days. In fact, when TR became president, Booker T. Washington was the first person he telegraphed to come to Washington and consult with him. As everybody tends to know, he also entertained Booker T. Washington to dinner in the White House a few weeks after he became president and created a national scandal by actually sitting down to dinner with a black man, never been done before in the White House. Their relationship became complicated later on, but when Booker T. died in 1915, TR was enormously moved and felt he had to go to Tuskegee and give him his final tribute.
This is odds and ends. Biographical note, Archibald Roosevelt Jr. in conversation with the author, meaning you, in 1988, speculated that TR, quote, probably was born with bicuspid aortic valve like cousin Kim's instead of the normal tricuspid. People with that problem often compensate for it in early life, but they get a telltale heart murmur, which is probably what TR's doctor at Harvard heard when he warned him to lead a sedentary life. When did he warn him to do that?
Oh, back in 1880 when he graduated. This doctor said to him, Mr. Roosevelt, you have this problem with your heart, and I advise you to live a scholarly, sedentary life and not do anything too physical. And TR's reaction was, I'm going to do everything you've told me not to do. I'm going to climb mountains, I'm going to live a vigorous life, and I'm going to die. I'm going to live life to the hilt, and I'm going to die at the age of 60, which is exactly what he did.
What did he die of?
A pulmonary embolism is the general conclusion, although I did put together a compendium of all his medical information, and I showed it to a former chairman of Sloan Kettering and his doctor's son, to Dr. Marks. And they both have the feeling that it was primarily a heart problem, not a lung problem. Failure of the heart, endocarditis.
The year he died?
He died on the Feast of the Epiphany, January the 6th, 1919.
Here's a biological note. TR's memory, and you mentioned this, was as comprehensive as it was photographic. It went far beyond the normal politician's knack of remembering names and faces, although his ability in that regard was phenomenal. What he saw or heard, and in particular what he read, registered with almost mechanistic clarity. How did you discover that?
Well, everybody commented on his memory throughout his life. There's ample testimonies how brilliant his memory was. But what really freaked me out researching this book was I came across a letter that T.R. wrote his son Kermit in response to a question from Kermit saying, "Dad, do you remember a poem by, I think her name was Edith Waters, about living south of the border?" And T.R. said yes, writing back in his handwriting. "Yes, I remember it very well. It goes like this." And he wrote out this entire 2-stanza poem by this very obscure poet who I'd never heard of. I thought, I'll just check this out. I looked her up. I found when this poem was published. T.R. wrote that letter, I believe, in 1914. The poem was published in 1898 in the Atlantic Monthly. I looked up that issue of the magazine and found that T.R. himself had an article in that same issue. In other words, in 1898, looking at his own article, he'd come across this poem in the magazine, registered it in his head. I compared the written words that he'd written in 1914, and I could see they were not copied from the magazine because there were several minor mistakes. But otherwise, it was word for word what he had written, what he had read and memorized 14, 15 years before. Quite creepy.
This is a historiographical note on page 634. Throughout his public career, he could be cavalier, even with the scripts of his major addresses printed as urtext in TR, works. That's, I assume,
that's his collected works.
Collected works. The improvisational humor he used to temper his seriousness can only be imagined, along with the radiance of the personality that infused these frequently dull texts with life. How much humor did he use? And I assume it wasn't in the text of these, so how'd you find out?
He was one of the funniest men who ever lived. His humor was like Mark Twain's. It came pouring out all the time. And unfortunately, transcriptions of his speeches tend to be from the actual typescript that he would hand out to reporters. So his improvisations, his witticisms, the jokes he would tell are not there in the transcripts. But there is so much testimony from people who knew him that he was hilariously funny. And when he wanted to be funny on paper, as in the long letters he wrote describing his grand tour of Europe in 1909 and his participation in King Edward VII's funeral. These letters are so funny that they could have been written by Charles Dickens or Mark Twain. They have, in fact, been published as a book, Cowboys and Kings. So one of the delights about working on him over all these years has been to write about somebody who was so funny.
On the 3 Roosevelt books, which one did you enjoy the most? And which one was the hardest to write?
Theodore X was the hardest because it was a political story. I do have to struggle when I'm writing about politics because my nature is to write about events and action and character. I'm not very happy with abstract issues of policy and stuff. So Rex was hard to write, but the one I've enjoyed writing most, oddly enough, has been this last book, Colonel Roosevelt, because the story is so narratively so fascinating. It's so constantly changing. He's running for the presidency one moment, he's exploring this longest river in tributary of the Amazon in 1914. He's an apostle of American participation in World War I. He's writing these intellectual essays. So the subject matter is constantly changing. And there's a very tragic death scene at the end, and all writers love to write death scenes.
Another footnote, this is a biographical note. Churchill dined with the Roosevelts in Albany and, quote, incensed his host by slumping in his chair, puffing on a cigar, and refusing to get up when women came into the room.
Winston Churchill. T.R. used to say that Winston Churchill, the novelist, there was an American novelist called Winston Churchill. He said, he's the gentleman. Winston Churchill, the English politician, is someone I do not care to meet. In fact, when he was in England for Edward VII's funeral, Churchill tried to meet with him and he refused to see him. I became intrigued as to why TR should have this animus against Winston Churchill. And I went through it, and I think it's two prima donnas. Churchill admired TR very much and constantly wanted to meet him, but TR, who was the older man, regarded Churchill as a vulgarian, a political turncoat. I think he was jealous of Churchill's literary abilities, because Churchill, when he was young, was a better writer than TR when he was young. Primarily a conflict of personality.
Was Bob Loomis your editor throughout all this?
Mm-hmm.
How many books did Bob Loomis at Random House edit for you? All 5?
I worked with Bob on Theodore Rex, on Dutch, and on Colonel Roosevelt.
Is he still active?
Yes, absolutely.
In his mid-80s?
Yes, he's already asked me what I want to do next. He's 85, I believe.
And what do you want to do next?
Haven't decided. I just know it'll be short. I wouldn't mind writing about another musician, or for that matter about a writer, but no more presidents.
Why not?
There's no more president more interesting to me than Theodore Roosevelt.
Where would you put Ronald Reagan next to Theodore Roosevelt in your interests?
Pretty well on the same level. I found Reagan quite fascinating, but for a different reason. He fascinated me because of his remoteness and because of his unconsciousness of who and what he was, whereas TR knew exactly who he was and what he was about, and was a totally upfront personality.
Are you glad this is over?
Yeah, I am. It's about time.
3 books, as we said, on Theodore Roosevelt: The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt, Roosevelt Rex, or Theodore Rex, and this brand new book, Colonel Roosevelt, by Edmund Morris, our guest, and we thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian.
For a DVD copy of this program, call 1-877-662-7726. For free transcripts or to give us your comments about this program, visit us at qna.org. Q&A programs are also available as C-SPAN podcasts.
The redesigned Booknotes website now